Now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer reportedly tried to have Ian Duncan-Smith fired 4 years ago, but the Work and Pensions Secretary, as he then was, refused to leave. That's according to an excerpt from a new book about what went on behind the scenes in the coalition government years, and it was written by a man who was at the very heart of it, the former Lib Dem Minister, David Laws. He's with me now. Very good morning to you, Mr. Laws. So what did you say? What's in the book about this? It seems like a pretty toxic relationship between George Osborne and Ian Duncan-Smith. What did you see of that?
Yeah, I think it's no secret that the two of them have never really got on as individuals. But running through this was a bigger tension about policy. The Chancellor, in a sense, trying to do his job, saw essentially the welfare budget as a huge cash cow that could be milked in order to deliver savings to reduce the budget deficit. Ian Duncan-Smith's focus really as Welfare Secretary was much more on welfare reform, getting people into employment. And some of that involves spending more money. So he was far less enthusiastic than George Osborne about cuts. And often in the coalition government, actually the Liberal Democrats and Nick Clegg would end up vetoing the cuts that the Treasury wanted.
That's the point, isn't it? I mean, I've read an unnamed Conservative minister's comments this morning saying that Ian Duncan-Smith actually misses the Lib Dems.
I think he probably does, because we were protection from some of the worst and most extreme George Osborne cuts. Ian knew that even if he couldn't see them off, Nick Clegg most certainly could veto them, and we often did. So what's obviously happened, I imagine, is since we've gone from a coalition government to a Conservative-only government, Ian no longer has the Liberal Democrats there to protect his budget. I don't think we would have had ludicrous policies such as the planned cuts in tax credits that we saw George Osborne try to deliver last year if the Lib Dems had been there. And I think that this must have made Ian Duncan-Smith feel a much more lonely and vulnerable figure in the government, much less able to defend his own departmental budget.
And do you think on the George Osborne side, he always had the knives out, even during the coalition years, for the Liberal Democrats? There were a couple of things he said during the course of that budget speech, which seemed a bit, ungracious to say the least, when he talked about, he tried to make it as a joke, saying, when the former pensions minister, Steve Webb, lost his seat, he said, I was trying to abolish the lump sum. Instead, we're going to keep the lump sum and try to abolish the Liberal Democrats.
Well, politics is a tough old business, so I don't resent George his little joke. The fact is there's always been a big difference in perspective between the Lib Dems and George Osborne about what budget priorities should be. And Osborne, I think, is in trouble this week with Ian Duncan-Smith and with the country, because he and David Cameron have always been focused on and obsessed by the interests of those on upper incomes, always trying to give them breaks in budgets. We saw that right throughout the coalition years, at a time when we should have been protecting those people on low incomes from austerity, and we sought to do that in coalition. And yet in the last week, George Osborne is giving away billions of pounds in tax cuts on things like capital gains tax, which helps people on upper incomes, actually makes tax avoidance much easier because of the difference between income tax and capital gains tax rates, at the same time as he's trying to make these huge cuts in the incomes of people reliant upon disability benefits. And I think that a lot of people in the country, let alone Ian Duncan-Smith, think that that is very unfair and want to push back against them.
Just to pick out one of the headlines from the excerpts from the book today about the National Health Service, it seems to have been some almost chicanery going on there. You identify the Conservatives leaning on Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of the NHS in England and Wales. Just tell us about that.
This is a huge issue, and it's not just about history, it's about where we're going to be with the NHS over the next few years. In 2014, the standards in the NHS were beginning to slip because their budget was under real pressure after a number of years of being protected but not seeing increases. And our focus was to try to increase the budget in the last year of the coalition. Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of the NHS, decided to do a piece of work of his own, estimating how much the NHS needed over this Parliament. And he came up with a figure of about £30 billion, which I think is sensible. And he thought he could make about half of that £30 billion in efficiency savings, and that he needed about £15 billion or £16 billion from the Treasury. The message he then got from the Conservatives in Downing Street was, no way the Chancellor and Prime Minister will give you 15 or 16 billion. That's a huge sum. If you come out with something like that, we'll just rubbish it and discredit it. You need to bump up the efficiency savings that you think you can make and reduce the figure that you need from the Treasury to 8 billion. He did that, and as a consequence, we're now assuming as a country that we can make 3 times the efficiency savings in the NHS that we have done over the entire period of the NHS being in existence, which I don't think anyone serious thinks we can do. Unless we change that and get serious figures for the NHS budget, we're going to see waiting times go up and service standards go down.
Mr. Laws, sorry, must end it there, but thank you very much indeed for those insights. David Laws there.